The moment I turned onto my driveway, I felt something was off. It wasn't just the usual silence of my property, there was a strange tension in the air, like something was about to happen. I had been living here for months, enjoying the peace of being on my own land, away from the chaos of city life. But today, something was different. A letter had arrived in my mailbox earlier in the week, one that I almost didn't even bother to open. It was from the HOA. But why would they be contacting me? I didn't live in their jurisdiction. Or at least, that's what I thought. I shook my head as I pulled into the gravel driveway, looking at the old farmhouse standing proud in the distance. The land stretched out around me, a peaceful haven that I'd dreamed of for years. Yet as I parked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to ruin it all. The quiet was suddenly interrupted by the loud buzz of my phone. It was an unknown number. I hesitated before picking up, the feeling in my gut growing stronger. When I answered, it was a woman's voice, sharp and formal, introducing herself as the president of the HOA. She was calling about a violation, something I was doing wrong on my property, but the thing was, I wasn't even a part of the HOA. My property wasn't under their jurisdiction, and I had no intention of being involved with them. As I listened to her speak, I tried to remain calm. She started listing all the things I was doing wrong, using my driveway too much, having a few plants that weren't up to their standards, and worst of all, parking my car in front of the house for more than a few hours. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I had purchased this land legally, free and clear, with no strings attached. Yet here was this stranger, trying to control things that were mine to decide. I tried to explain this, but the woman, Natalie, as she introduced herself, was having none of it. Her voice was condescending, and there was no room for negotiation. She told me if I didn't comply, I would face legal consequences. I could hear the satisfaction in her tone, as if she believed she already had me cornered. But there was one thing she didn't know, this wasn't going to be easy. I wasn't going to let some HOA bully dictate what I could and couldn't do on my own land. Still, I had to wonder, how had they gotten my number? How did they know about my property? The thought bothered me, and I realized then that things were going to escalate. But I wasn't going to back down. Not this time. The days that followed were a blur of letters and phone calls. Each one more aggressive than the last. The HOA didn't give up, not even when I tried to explain, not even when I told them point blank that I wasn't part of their association. They didn't care. The first official letter I received was threatening enough, claiming that I was violating all these non-existent rules on my property. They said my driveway usage was excessive and that I was parking in front of my house too long, things I had never thought would be an issue. It wasn't like I had a fleet of cars or was running a business from my driveway. I was just using my land as I pleased, as anyone should be able to. But the HOA seemed determined to make an example out of me. The next letter came with a fine, $50 per day for every violation. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Surely, they couldn't be serious. So, I ignored it, assuming they'd figure it out and realize they had the wrong address or something. But then came the second letter, and then the third. The fines kept growing. They were starting to pile up, and the tone of their letters was becoming more urgent, more threatening. I could feel the weight of each one as I read it, the small print promising even worse consequences if I didn't comply. They talked about the possibility of legal action, even though they had no right to do so. I started to get nervous, not about the fines, they were a joke, but about what might happen next. I began to worry that they might take it further, that they could escalate the situation to something I couldn't handle on my own. As the days dragged on, I felt more and more trapped. The HOA's power over my life, over my property, was suffocating, and I began to wonder just how far they would go to make me bend to their will. By now, I had done everything I could to stay calm and handle it on my own, but deep down, I knew I couldn't let this go on much longer. Something had to change. I needed help, someone who knew the law and could take on this fight. The breaking point came when I received a certified letter. This wasn't just another fine or demand for compliance, it was something worse. The letter was an official notice that I was being sued. The HOA was claiming that I had violated their rules so egregiously that they had no choice but to take me to court. I couldn't believe it. They had no legal right to enforce any of their so-called rules on my property, and yet here they were, using the full force of the law to make their demands stick. The letter stated that if I didn't settle, I would face a lawsuit that would cost me thousands of dollars in legal fees and fines, along with the possibility of losing my property. The absurdity of it all was almost too much to handle. I sat there staring at the letter, trying to understand what had gone so wrong. All I wanted was to live my life on my own land, free from the restrictions of a neighborhood association. But now, it seemed like they had every intention of dragging me through a legal nightmare, hoping I would back down. I wasn't going to let them win. But I also knew that I needed help, and fast. That's when I started researching property law and HOAs in my area. I needed someone who could fight back, someone who knew how to handle a legal battle like this. After hours of searching, I found a lawyer who came highly recommended, an attorney who had successfully helped homeowners win cases against overreaching HOAs. I wasted no time in contacting her, explaining my situation in detail. I was exhausted, overwhelmed, and unsure of what the next steps should be. The lawyer, who introduced herself as Isa Carter, immediately scheduled a consultation, telling me that this was exactly the kind of case she specialized in. I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of this nightmare. But as I sat in her office days later, waiting for her to review all the documents, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get a lot more complicated before they got better. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, meetings, and strategies. Isa wasted no time getting to work, pulling together a solid defense based on the fact that my property was legally separate from the HOA's jurisdiction. It was clear from the county records that I wasn't part of the association, but that didn't stop the HOA from ramping up their efforts to intimidate me. They weren't backing down, not even when they received the cease and desist letter Isa drafted. In fact, they doubled down. A week later, I received another letter, this one from their lawyer, accusing me of interfering with HOA business and trying to sabotage their operations. The letter was full of legal jargon, threats of further fines, and veiled warnings of potential lawsuits. I was furious, but also a bit amused by the audacity of it all. They knew they didn't have a leg to stand on, yet they were still trying to bully me into submission. It was clear they wanted to make an example out of me, to send a message that anyone who challenged their authority would be crushed. But I wasn't going to let that happen. Isa had already warned me that this fight wouldn't be easy. She explained that some HOAs would rather drag a case through the courts, even without a valid argument, just to tire their opponents out and force them into submission. The legal battle was far from over, and as each day passed, the pressure mounted. I started noticing strange things happening around the property, cars parked across the street, watching me. It wasn't subtle, and it was unsettling. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable, with people starting to avoid me, exchanging uncomfortable glances whenever I walked past. It was like the HOA was poisoning the well, turning everyone against me, spreading rumors that I was a troublemaker and that I didn't follow the rules. The isolation was starting to take its toll, but I refused to let them break me. I wasn't just fighting for my property, I was fighting for my right to live without fear of oppressive control. But things took a darker turn when I noticed security guards walking around my land. They looked official, clipboard in hand, taking notes as if they had some kind of authority. I didn't recognize them, and when I confronted them, they didn't even bother to answer my questions. It was clear they had been sent there to intimidate me, to make me feel like I was being watched every second of the day. I knew it was time to take a stand. The next morning, I made a decision. I was going to make it clear that I wouldn't be intimidated any longer. I put up a sign at the entrance of my property, one that couldn't be ignored, one that would make it crystal clear to anyone passing by that I wasn't part of the HOA. It wasn't just a simple yard sign, it was a massive banner with bold, black letters that read, "This property is not part of the HOA. Stop sending false violations. Trespassers will be prosecuted." I wasn't playing games anymore. This was my land, and I was going to make sure everyone knew it. But as I stood there, looking at the sign, I had a strange feeling, this wasn't over. I knew the HOA wouldn't take this lying down. A few days after I put up the sign, things seemed to calm down. There were no new letters, no more fines piling up, and for the first time in weeks, I thought maybe the HOA had backed off. But deep down, I knew better. They were just biding their time, waiting for the right moment to strike. I wasn't going to let my guard down. Sure enough, it wasn't long before I saw Natalie's black SUV pull up outside my house. She stepped out with a look on her face that could only be described as pure fury, her heels clicking sharply against the gravel as she stormed up to my fence. She was livid, pointing at the massive sign I had put up with a mix of disbelief and anger. There was no attempt at civil conversation, just a demand that I take the sign down immediately. Her posture was rigid, and her tone was nothing short of condescending, as if she still believed she had the power to control everything around here. I stood firm, refusing to back down. She could threaten all she wanted, but I knew my rights. This wasn't her land to dictate. She argued, insisting that the HOA had every right to enforce their rules, but I wasn't buying it. She could see it in my eyes, this wasn't a fight I was going to lose. And just like that, she left, her face flushed with frustration. But even as she drove away, I knew this wasn't over. The HOA had their sights set on me, and I wasn't going to give up without a fight. But things were about to take a strange turn. A few days later, I noticed a black sedan parked across the street from my house, the same one I'd seen before. This time, the driver didn't even bother to hide as he drove off quickly when I stepped outside. It was clear they were watching me. I couldn't ignore the feeling that they were trying to gather evidence, maybe trying to find something to use against me. But the more they watched, the more determined I became. I wasn't going to let them get away with it. Over the next few days, I noticed more odd behavior from the neighbors. People who had once been friendly suddenly avoided eye contact. Conversations would abruptly stop when I walked past. It felt like I was being blacklisted, as if the HOA was poisoning the well, turning everyone against me. But that only made me more determined to stand my ground. The real shock came when I saw two men in uniform walking around my property one afternoon. They didn't belong here, there was no reason for security guards to be on my land, especially without any official notice. They were walking around, taking notes on clipboards, as if they were conducting some sort of inspection. When I approached them, they wouldn't even answer my questions, simply stating they were here for a routine inspection to make sure the property was compliant with HOA standards. I immediately knew something was wrong. I wasn't part of the HOA, so they had no business being on my property. I told them to leave, but they hesitated, clearly expecting me to back down. I didn't. I gave them a firm warning, either leave, or I'd call the sheriff. That was all it took. They turned and walked away, but one of them shot me a smug look as they left. It wasn't over. A few days later, I saw flashing lights in my driveway. 2 police cruisers pulled up, and I froze. I could feel my heart race in my chest. Standing beside one of the officers was Natalie, her arms crossed, looking like she was preparing for a confrontation. The officer knocked on my door, demanding I'd step outside. My mind raced. This wasn't just about fines or property disputes anymore, this was getting dangerous. But I wasn't going to let them intimidate me. I stepped outside, keeping my cool as the officer explained that there had been reports of harassment and hostile behavior from my side toward the HOA. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Natalie was claiming that I had caused a disturbance, that I was refusing to comply with regulations, and now I was being accused of harassing the HOA. But this time, I was ready. I calmly handed the officer the property records, proof that I wasn't part of their association, that I had every right to live on my property without interference. I stood there, heart pounding in my chest, watching the officers examine the documents. It felt like the longest few minutes of my life. But when the officer looked up at me, I saw it, something had changed. The tension in his face began to loosen, and I could see the doubt creeping in. They weren't here to arrest me anymore. They were here to deal with the truth. Natalie stood frozen, her face pale, as the officer turned to her. He shook his head and pointed toward her SUV, telling her to leave. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt the smallest sense of victory. But it wasn't over yet. The neighborhood began buzzing the next morning. News of the confrontation spread fast, and the HOA had no choice but to act. An emergency meeting was called, and for the first time, it wasn't about trivial things like lawns or mailboxes, it was about Natalie. The board members quickly voted to remove her as president. By the end of the week, she was gone, and her power was stripped away. The new president, Russell, was a breath of fresh air. He came to my door, not to demand anything, but to apologize. He explained that they were cleaning house, undoing the damage Natalie had caused. It wasn't much, but it was enough. The HOA was starting to turn a corner. By the end of the month, things had quieted down. The harassment stopped, the ridiculous fines disappeared, and for the first time, I could breathe freely again. My land was mine, and no one was going to take that from me.